Hello, everybody. Welcome to Socialist Republic, the podcast devoted to discussing socialism online. I'm your host, Landon Mitchell. We're here today again with our very distinguished guest, Dr. Richard Carrier. Now, Dr. Carrier, I know you've introduced yourself on the podcast before, but for those of you who aren't familiar with Dr. Carrier, could you please give us a quick introduction?
Yeah, you bet. Richard Carrier, PhD. My PhD field was ancient intellectual history, history of philosophy and science and religion at Columbia University. And and I have had two tracks in my life: ancient history and doing a lot of Christian counter apologetics, for example, and contemporary philosophy, so contemporary naturalist philosophy. And I'm published in both fields and have my website, richardcarrier.info, where people can uh, look at my long form blogging, which is, we were just talking about how that's a dying thing. But nonetheless, it's the thing that my patrons basically hire me to keep going doing. And I do philosophy, history, some social, cultural, politics stuff. And I guess, that's where we've intersected.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And the reason I've invited you onto the show today is because of your expertise in philosophy and Christian apologetics. And today we agreed to talk about a Christian theologian and philosopher named William Lane Craig. Now, of course, many people online are familiar with William Lane Craig. And do you mind giving us just a bit of background on Dr. Craig?
Oh gosh, he's retired now. I don't know how much he does appearances still, but he started out, gosh, in the early '80s, I would say, doing resurrection apologetics, a famous Christian apologist. He came from a background of professional debate, so he actually was a rare animal in the philosophy and apologetics field, is someone who actually is a professionally trained debater. And that led to his reputation for being the master of debate. Like, he was the best debater on the Christian side, and so gained a reputation for that, and wrote a lot of Christian apologetics, and not just history, but in philosophy. Like, he wrote a few books on the philosophy of time, for example, because he had to push certain ideas of time to get his particular theology defended. And so he's got a rep for that kind of thing. I think he just recently came out with a book. I don't know if it's out yet or is about to come out, where it's a comprehensive Christian worldview defense, similar to what Moreland did, which was Scaling the Secular City back in the '80s, and that was the book. The J.P. Moreland's book, Scaling the Secular City, was what kind of inspired my book, Sense and Goodness Without God, is kind of like the answer to that. Like, what if that's the Christian worldview? What is the non-Christian worldview? With an emphasis on what should we believe, rather than just talking about what we don't believe. What should we believe? What replaces all the things that he uses to explain that stuff? And Craig himself just came out with sort of that sort of thing, obviously from his own point of view, but recently. And I might actually dig into that book and see if there's more to say in terms of responding to it. But this results in he's very famous for this, and I've written blogs, very highly critical of his work, and I've debated him live, even on actual internet or national television, back when the PAX Christian Network was a thing, and I was on a show Lee Strobel hosted. These are all like names for, maybe newbies don't know these names, but if you were active in the field of Christians versus atheists in the '90s or early 2000s, you definitely knew these names. And so, yeah, so I've had a lot of interaction with William Lane Craig and his work, and have strong opinions.
Right. And my particular background on Craig is that I wrote an essay on William Lane Craig's theistic moral argument when I was in college, and I won an award from my department for that. And
Awesome.
I think you raised a good question, which is it's not just about what we don't believe; it's about what we replace theism with. And I think that's a good segue into our topic for today, which is morality. And basically, in the absence of the existence of God, what can we say about morality? Can we still say we believe in uh, objective moral values and moral duties? And In what sense? So, I was wondering if you could give our viewers a sort of introduction to William Lane Craig's theistic moral argument, and I call it the theistic moral argument rather than the moral argument as Craig does, because I think there are lots of different kinds of moral arguments, and this particular one
Right.
is a theistic one. So like I didn't want to give Craig that rhetorical ground where he kind of monopolizes
Right.
moral arguments in theistic terms rather than specifically saying that it's a theistic moral argument, right?
Yeah, and also like how he defends the premises changes from debate to debate or article to article. So it's hard to pin down like the specific like actual nitty-gritty of what his position is. But the basic gist of the argument is that moral facts only make sense if there's a God. There are moral facts, therefore there's a God. And so like he frames it as a deductive argument, but he'll admit that it's really an empirical argument and an epistemic argument, a probabilistic argument. It was the idea is like, because we're pretty sure moral facts exist, therefore we should be pretty sure God exists. And of course, you can attack either of the premises there, and atheists often attack the moral facts exist thing, try to defend some sort of moral relativism or whatever. Uh, I go the other way. I attack the other thing. Is like, obviously you don't need gods for objective moral facts to exist, but that's not obvious. So a lot of people have a hard time accepting or understanding that, which I think is what he's playing on when he makes this argument.
Hmm. And speaking of moral facts, so on Craig's account, we know that objective moral values exist because we have this faculty for moral intuition, which enables us to experience the objective rightness or wrongness of an act. Craig writes that we know objective moral values exist because we clearly apprehend some of them, and he labels these moral intuitions a properly basic belief, a belief that we are rational to hold, absence of any overriding reasons. And one of the things that I found interesting about this account is that Craig doesn't actually really seem to offer any justification for the notion of properly basic beliefs.
Right. And he doesn't even like necessarily lean on planting either for that, but he does have that, like it's in the background of his arguments, right? Is this idea, definitely the intuitionist idea that how would it's kind of like a C.S. Lewis argument, although Lewis was very bad at making this argument because it was very easy to like catch everything he's saying. That's moral relativism that you're describing. Craig knows not to go there. Um, but what he does is plays on this, especially because if he's playing to Western audiences, since we've all sort of culturally inherited a certain set of moral values, he will say like, well, you all feel that this is right. Where is that feeling coming from, and why do we all agree? That's the idea. Now, of course, you could immediately attack like, well, there's like huge moral disagreements. There isn't the widespread agreement that you think, but he would downplay those kinds. He would try to appeal to like more core values, and maybe we're wrong about how to implement those values, but we agree with like honesty is important, and we agree that compassion is important. Although he would never use the word compassion, I don't think. And so that's what he's trying to say, that there's no other explanation for this other than God putting it there, right? Or like somehow this is coming from God. But he'll also make the argument, and it's kind of like a moral risk argument, which is this idea that, well, if you say that there are no objective moral facts, then morals can be whatever we want. And if morals can be whatever we want, then like, well, we're in dire straits then, right? Like what's to say that anybody should be moral, and therefore how can we live in a society that we could trust, and so on. It's kind of answering his own question, but the idea though is this idea that if people will be so terrified of the prospect that there is no moral truth, that they'll have to lean on, there has to be a God to make sure there's moral truth. And so this is a very common form of Christian moral argument in terms of that. It's totally fallacious, right? But he will make that emotional appeal when he's trying to avoid being overtly like emotional appeal, and he wants to make the argument look sound. He'll appeal to what you're talking about, which is this idea that he doesn't call it basic beliefs, but he's appealing to something like that, is like there's some sort of sense in us and we all have it, and there's no explanation for that other than God. And there's a lot of different ways he'll defend that, like attacking the alternative, which is that that feeling comes from evolution, or that feeling comes from our cultural background. Um, he gets in like he has a harder time maintaining the premise when he faces someone like Kagan or me, who will just say, well, actually it comes from reason, right? Like that there's you can give a rational basis that if you want to be a rational person, morality is just entailed automatically. Like doesn't matter if there's a God or not. In fact, God couldn't even change it, right? He couldn't even change what it would be rational for a rational person to do. And so and then you can get into things like social contract theory, game theory, reciprocity, and then also the psychology. There's a lot of moral psychology about how difficult it is to maintain sanity and rationality without being honest with yourself, with what sort of person you are, and whether you even like that sort of person or not. And so there becomes this sort of would we even say like Kantian sense of there's a sort of person we want to be because we really, if we admitted it to ourselves, we couldn't live with it, and we really want to be this better sort of person. And once you admit that, then that entails a bunch of things as well. And so there's a lot of ways to derive this, showing that all rational agents in all possible universes would face both of these realities, the sort of reciprocal reality that if you're going to live in a community, there are certain ways to behave that are just optimally better for all your interests, right? And then also at the same time, all rational agents are going to have this self-reflective reason where it becomes irrational or contradictory to behave in a way that makes you the sort of person that you loathe or despise rather than the sort of person that you respect and admire. And so that molds, so both directions are coming at you and they mold you into a particular direction as to what the moral thing is. And this will happen in all possible universes, right? There's no way you could change anything. You could change what the morals are on the ground by changing the physics and things like that. But the sort of self-reflective and game theoretic reality that rational agents have to deal with is always the same in that sense. There's still always some sort of rationally objective, true moral set of beliefs in each universe. They might differ from universe to universe, but there always is going to be one. And I have a peer reviewed study arguing this point against all the objections that anybody could think of, including my peer reviewers for that, which is in the journal Religion. The title is "Objective Moral Facts Exist in All Possible Universes." So it's like a very, the title says it all. And then it defends that from this point of view that moral facts are just facts about rational agents. And so in any universe where there's a rational agent, there will be an objectively true set of moral facts for that agent. And that's what I document in there, and I show how God would fit into this picture, even if he existed, but in no way is he ever needed for these facts to be true and for us to argue for them and so on. So if people are interested in that, that's actually open access, so there's no paywall, so people can find that online to check that out. And that's kind of like the starting thread, because from there I cite a lot of other stuff, other people's studies in psychology and philosophy, and then my stuff that I've done that sort of backgrounds all of this.
Right. And I feel like there's even like a Habermasian tie into what you're saying with communicative rationality. You
That's
know,
right.
if you want to, say anything, you're already agreeing to certain intersubjective norms about how to communicate, right? And that definitely has an ethical component to it. But I'd like to go to like what you were saying about the plethora of moral disagreements we have about ethics, because I feel like this is like the death knell for Craig's notion of moral intuitions, because like I don't know how we can account for this without almost being chauvinistic in a way. Because if everybody is endowed with a reliable capacity for moral intuition in Craig's sense of the term, most people across the planet would come to the same conclusions about ethics. And that's obviously not the case. And it seems to me that would have to say that, you know, cultures that subscribe to Islam or Buddhism, somehow the people who subscribe to these have like deficient moral faculties or something, right?
Yeah, right. Even Jesus, right? Because William Lane Craig, his own Lord. And I have an article on this called "You're Probably Worshiping the Antichrist." It's "Dear Christian, You're Probably Worshiping the Antichrist," where I show that like mainstream evangelical Christianity teaches the opposite of what Jesus taught morally on subject after subject after subject. and that's hard to explain based on that model. But I think it's even worse than you described, because I've come to this conclusion that I think all arguments for God become arguments against God when you bring in all the evidence that they're leaving out. So Christian apologetics depends on leaving evidence out. They present a case, and it's what they've left out that is the important stuff. And so when you put that stuff back in, then the argument flips the other way. And you just made the point that is similar to this, which in my article online, Bayesian counter apologetics, and also 10 ways the world would be different if God existed. In those articles, I have a whole section, couple paragraphs on the argument, the moral argument, and it's the basic point is that if you think of these as explanatory hypotheses, like if we think Craig's God theory is true, then what should we expect to see? We should expect to see what you described, that everybody should agree on moral facts from the beginning of writing, even before the writing, but we would only know from writing. So from like 4000 BC, in all cultures, China to the West, everywhere, all the way up to now, like when the explorers hit America and met Native American tribes, they would all agree, like, yeah, we have the same morals. How interesting. Same moral beliefs. Like, it would be consistent through all time and consistent across all cultures historically. That's what we would expect to observe in that case. Whereas if atheism is true and morality is a technology, it's something that we invent, and it's something we can optimize to a goal. So the morality is a thing that achieves goal. And so we didn't start knowing very much about it. We had really bad moralities, and we had a bunch of varieties of moralities. And through trial and error, we learned which moralities led to bad outcomes that we didn't like. And so, things go better for us personally in our inner spirit. Things go better for our society if we adopt these morals rather than these morals. And over time, morality has gotten better and better and better through thousands of years, right? And none of the improvements really come from religion. They come from like human reason and human experience in terms of what matters. And a classic example is slavery, right? Like, so why did it take us 4,000 years to finally realize, and probably we should have to say 40,000 years if we like going back to the beginning of evidence of religious thought. Why did any of us think slavery was okay? Slavery was not an industrial thing in China. Like, slavery was a punitive thing. They're punitive slaves, meaning like you got convicted of something, or you were a traitor or something, you could be enslaved. But these are like a very small scale, less than 1% of the population. Their entire industry, their agriculture and so on, was never built. Their economy was never built on slavery. So how is it that the Chinese, for thousands and thousands of years, got it right that slavery is wrong, whereas in the West, the actual biblical morality is pro-slavery, like adamantly pro-slavery. Even Jesus is very like wishy-washy. He never says slavery is bad, and slavery is endorsed in the epistles and so on. And Jesus says that not one jot or tittle of the law will disappear. The jot or tittle includes all of this legalization, even commanding not just slavery, not just chattel slavery, but sex slavery even. So, which is grossly immoral. And so, like, how is it that happened? Well, the atheist model explains this. It's like, we were bad at this. We didn't understand what morals should be true. We had to like suffer the consequences of living with bad moralities until we learned our lesson, and then we had to retool and get better. And so this is what you expect if morality is a learned technology. It's something that we perfect over time and figure out as a better way to live, and therefore doesn't come from a God and doesn't need to come from a God. It would be helpful if a God could have explained all this to us, 4,000 years ago, but that didn't happen. So really, the fact that the atheism model predicts exactly what we observe in the moral sphere. The theism model does not predict what we observe. So in fact, the moral argument, the facts, the real facts of human moral reasoning are evidence against God. They're not evidence for God. And so it flips his argument upside down. And this is a point that I've argued multiple times.
Right. And so having dealt with moral values a bit, let's turn to the subject of moral duties, which is a second component of Craig's premise. So according to Craig, objective moral duties are obligations we have regardless of whether or not we think we have them. And interestingly, he doesn't really even argue for the existence of these duties. He more just claims that theism is the best explanation for them. And I kind of want to explore this in the context of Plato's famous Euthyphro dilemma. in Euthyphro, Socrates asks Euthyphro, is something pious because the gods approve of it, or do the gods approve of it because it is pious? Um, what would you say about the Euthyphro consideration?
Yeah, yeah, I think it's sound reasoning, and I think it can be. There was an attempt. I don't remember if it was Craig or Moreland or who came up with this sort of dodge to say, well, we could get rid of the Euthyphro dilemma if we just say that moral values are inherent properties of God, right? So that he's not commanding things arbitrarily. They're just inherent in his nature. They could not be otherwise. And so that explains this and somehow bypasses this dilemma. In the article that I cited, objective moral facts exist in all possible universes, I directly challenge this and show that actually no, that just moves the argument one step back, but you end up with the same problem. Is that how do you decide whether the nature of God is good or not? Is it good merely because it's God, or is it good for some other reason? And if it's good for some other reason, then we don't need God. We just need that reason. And that's actually the position of most atheist moral objectivists. Whereas if it's just because he's God, well, then it's arbitrary because God could be like the Old Testament says, like totally pro-slavery. And if that's inherent in his nature, right, is that's the nature of God. Therefore, we would have to conclude it's good. Which clearly doesn't work because that conflicts with the very intuitions that Craig is appealing to. And so the question is, why do we have that conflict? Why is it that we don't just accept whatever God is as good? And the reason is because that's not how we define good. How we define good in practical fact, like in our lives, is do things go better for us and the people we care about or not? Right? Like so, and so it's really about human welfare. Like, are we talking about misery, or are we talking about life satisfaction? Are we talking about contentment with life? Like, these are kinds of things that all humans, and really in all possible worlds, all rational agents really want more than anything else, is to not be miserable and to have a more contented life. And and from that groundwork of that fundamental goal rationally derives all moral values. And so this idea of why is slavery bad, it comes through this cascade of values where we realize, well, actually, that's pretty shitty. Like, I like this, my friend over here who's a slave and being treated terribly. Why is he being treated differently than me? Why should he be owned? Why does it even make sense for anyone to be owned? Why can't he be a free, independent person like everybody else, and so on? So when you start thinking about the world that way, it doesn't make any rational sense. And it makes better sense to have a sort of freedom among equals kind of arrangement. And the more you realize that, the more you build out those values and realize that those are good. And so that's how you would judge whether God was good or evil. So if God existed and he was anti-equality, pro-slavery, and all of this, he would be a bad God. You would say, like, I think that's a terrible God. It's an immoral God. You would not say that that's, oh, well, then I guess I should be on board with slavery. That must be good because it's God's thing. That's not actually how people approach moral reasoning, even at the intuitive level that Craig is appealing to.
Right. And I think this kind of goes back to what you're saying that, theists leave out some of the facts when they make these arguments, and atheists can win when we bring in all the facts. Because it seems like the theist in the moral argument always wants to go to ontology instead of epistemology. And I think the naturalist can really win on the epistemological considerations involved,
Right. Yeah.
like the ones that you brought up, like how do we know that God is the greatest conceivable being whose commands flow necessarily from his moral nature? Because if you believe it on faith, that's not a rational basis, and if you believe it on an independent moral standard, then you don't really need God. And if you're saying, "Well, I know because of God," then you're just going in circles, right?
That's
And
right. Yeah.
and
Right.
and then everything just gets pushed back a step because then they say, "Oh well, I know God is maximally great because that's true a priori." And then it's like, well, how do you establish that a priori? Like how have theists tried to establish this a priori, or where like
Yeah, they tried. It's never succeeded. A good modern example is Edward Feser. He has his, I think it's called the Five Ways. No, wait, called something else, but it's based on the Five Ways of Aquinas. But he's trying to like update Aquinas in a sense. And I've written articles about this. And it's the ontological argument in various forms, like trying to say that God is a maximally great being. So, but the challenge is when you have to say like, well, what would be better, like a maximally good God or a maximally evil God? How would you decide which one was better that isn't circular or whatever, right? So to say that there has to be this, so even if they could prove that there's maximally great God, that doesn't establish that they would be maximally morally good. They could be maximally morally bad, and therefore be maximally the greatest thing in that sense. They triumph even over morality, like that. That's this no greater power that you could make these kind of ridiculous arguments. So the argument internally doesn't even work. Like when they get into the weeds trying to pull moral reasoning out of this, and Phaser really struggles poorly to try and get moral beliefs out of the sort of being that he tries to argue for ontologically, sort of a priori. It's very like circular and wishy-washy and hand-wavy. It doesn't really work, and it's certainly not deductively valid. But also, they can't establish the maximally great being because that's an existential fallacy. It's based on converting the indicative to the subjunctive and back again in the middle of the argument. So it's actually not even a valid, like the ontological argument doesn't even work. There's no version of it that actually works. There's just more and more convoluted ways of hiding the mistake. But they've never accomplished this. So there's never been a successful deductive proof of the a priori existence of God or nature of God. It's just never happened. So like you were hinting at, they just hand wave that and just say, well, I believe it on faith that there's this a priori truth that is logically necessarily the case that God has to be good. But of course, that doesn't solve the problem you're talking about, because even if you say, okay, I just believe that God he just has to be the maximally greatest and therefore the maximally goodest God. And even if you were convinced of that, that still doesn't answer the question as, well, then what is maximally goodest, right? Like where do you get that information? And that's like what you're appealing to, is you can't appeal to your intuitions, because we know the intuitions are highly unreliable because they're based on culture and history and happenstance and possibly some evolutionary background and so on. So they're not, that's not reliable, right? And so again, intuition used to say slavery was cool, right? So clearly intuition is not reliable. So you can't appeal to that. So how do you know the maximally goodest God? Like even if you know that they're the goodest, how do you know what is goodest? Like what is it? Like is honesty the goodest? Like how do you know, is that what it is? Because then that runs into also trouble with the Bible, because there's a lot of dishonesty coming from God. God hides. He does a lot of violating of the basic oath of telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. He doesn't tell the whole truth. He often doesn't tell the truth. He often deliberately lies. And so that the biblical God doesn't fit that model either. So you have to kind of shoehorn it in. But there's what's the rational demonstration that honesty would be the bestest, and therefore the bestest God would be honest? There's still no philosophical defense of that. And if you could come up with one, it would obviously cannot circularly appeal to the mere fact that it is God. It would have to appeal to something else, and whatever that is, of course, everybody else can appeal to. You don't need God to get it, right? And that's the kind of thing where I get to the whole point of social contract theory, game theory, and self-satisfaction psychology. All of these things that we know are actually generative of moral positions and moral values, and even moral duties, which are just restatements of the social understanding of the social contract of like what duties do we think we have to fulfill and others fulfill to us for society to go a good way, for us to be able to achieve all the other things we want to achieve. Like what makes society work better for us and everybody else is that kind of thing. And we have philosophers like John Rawls and others that have come up with like rational ways to conclude this without, it doesn't require any appeal to God or the supernatural or anything like that. So yeah, it's kind of a dead end. But I do think like atheist philosophers often avoid this route. They usually go the cultural relativism route or the moral relativism route, which avoids the ontological question, right? It goes to the epistemological question. And so the line of attack is to attack the weak point, which is the ontological question. That's why I dive in and I fill that up. I brick that up. I build out the ontological side of this. And I have an article online called the Ontology of Moral Facts, where I work this out and comparing it to the fearsomeness of bears, right? And I talk about how there's like physical relativity can actually generate physically, objectively true facts. And so moral relativity can also actually end up deriving objective facts as well in a similar way as to whether bears are fearsome or not is always a relational fact between the bear and whoever is supposed to be afraid of it. And that fact is an objective fact. It's true of that relation, but it's a truth about the entire relation between the person and the bear. It's not a true fact of the person by themselves. It's not a true fact about the bear by itself. It's a truth about the system. And moral facts are like that. Moral facts are facts about what is it, how should we behave so that we could be satisfied with ourselves, with who we are and who in the way we act, and to produce the better society that we need to accomplish all the other goals that we have. And there are objectively true answers to that question, and they're true in all possible worlds, whether God exists or not.
So in these last 7 minutes, we should turn to the pragmatic concern that Craig labels the madhouse option. So, and I mean, calling it the madhouse option is actually pretty offensive, but um, kind of offensive to the community of mentally ill people like myself. But in the absence of objective moral values and duties, are human beings permitted to do anything and everything? And I feel like here, I don't know if you're familiar with Philip Kitcher's pragmatic naturalism.
I've only by acquaintance. I've not read it. I was actually kind of looking forward to hearing you summarize it for me.
Oh yeah, sure. And this is kind of where I go with morality. And so um Kitcher is a pragmatic naturalist. And basically what he does is he judges ethical propositions by their usefulness for promoting altruism. Um, and Craig's argument here would probably be, well, under naturalism, um, altruism has no objective value. It's arbitrary to say we should care about uh, altruism, right?
Right.
And I feel like theism, given the epistemological problems that we've talked about, actually faces the same exact problem as naturalistic ethics. Because if God gives me a command, like I have no rational basis for following that command just because God said so. And
Right.
like to follow God's commands, you have to care about God's commands. And then it's like,
That's
oh,
right.
well,
Yeah.
if you don't follow God's commands, then you'll go to hell. And then it's like, well, what if I don't care about that? So it really just reaches the same problem where it's like, um, I like as Kitcher says, whatever your normative theory is, you can always ask like, why should I act in a way that conforms to that theory? Because like what he says is, if I reject these rules, I'm hardly doing something similar to positing a statement in its negation. It's not like a contradiction to say you don't care about God's commands or you don't care about human flourishing, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I find that when you look at the literature outside philosophy that deals with this, so you've got moral psychology, you've got the sociology of morality, and some of the philosophy that touches on those things, that like Axelrod and so forth, who do game theory, they don't use the word altruism. I think it's kind of a loaded word. People have ideas of what that means, and people don't agree between each other, so they're talking past each other when they're talking about altruism. The word that everybody else uses, the people who are doing this more scientifically, is pro-sociality and cooperation. So cooperative societies are more successful for every member of the society than non-cooperative societies. And when you say it like that, it seems kind of obvious that that would be the case. But you can actually diagram it out. Like there are actually objectively bad decisions to make in game theory scenarios based on that cooperation is always better. And altruism is just a form, sort of a realization of cooperation. But it's not just like blind, I'm just pragmatically going to decide to be a cooperative person, even though I hate everybody. It gets to this Aristotelian position that if you want to reliably, like, even comprehend the situation you're in, and therefore act consistently the best way to get the best outcomes, you actually do have to cultivate empathy, like this idea that you actually have to see things from the other person's point of view and actually appreciate the fact that their like actions that you engage cause emotions in them. It might cause physical damage, might cause emotional or psychological damage or whatever, might help them financially or hurt them financially. Like it has consequences on them, and you can put yourself in their shoes and say, like, is that how I would want to be treated if I were in the same situation that they were? And that's something that only a rational agent can do, right? To actually work through that whole logical loop there. And then once you've done that, then it becomes easier to realize why not only are cooperative societies better for you, but they're actually better for your inner life, because you actually have access to goods, compassion, compersion, the joys of sharing the emotions with other people and their joys and so on. That there are actually goods that you can access through empathy that you can't access otherwise, and so that it's actually better to be an empathic person, that you're actually cutting off a whole richness of life that you have access to. You're actually making your life objectively worse if you try to cut empathy out of your life rather than build it up. And so you can work through these things in moral psychology. There's Walter Sinnott Armstrong series called Moral Psychology. There's a Catholic scholar named Bergman who gives a perfectly secular, because he's a psychologist, so he gives a perfectly psychological explanation for why the highest level, like of child development, like the child development starts with the idea that you are good or bad based on punishment. If I do this, I get slapped. If I do that, I get yelled at, or I get pushed in the corner or whatever. And so that you have this sort of punishment carrot and stick mentality. And then when you actually get more evolved into that, like you become more rational, more aware, and thinking it through, eventually you get to a state where you want to be good because you actually you prefer to be a better person. Like when you reflect on yourself, you're happier about yourself and feel better about yourself when you are a good person by that kind of standard, so that you actually are self-driven to be moral. It's actually good. You see it as something you want to be. You want to be that sort of person. And that's the highest, like the most mature level of development, essentially, in the human psychological development. And so, and this is well studied at Piaget and various others. Scientists have looked at this, but Bergman makes this point that once you put this together with everything else we know about contemporary psychology today, about the human mind, and probably all minds would have to have this, that this idea of being an empathic person, of cultivating the virtue of compassion, actually is good for us. It's good for us directly, but it's also good for us in creating this pro-social attitude. And you can show in game theory that actually does reciprocate back to you statistically more often to your benefit than not. And so, and then of course you have to mediate it with reasonableness. Like you're not like a gullible person who gives everything away, but you are still a generous person who takes a pro-social stance. And so that you can show in game theory that there's just enough amount of cooperation with enough suspicion to like not be too paranoid, but to not be too gullible. There's actually an objectively tunable state, and it kind of aligns with what we all agree is the proper moral stance to take. The reasonable, pragmatic moral position to take in anything. So, so when you look at, I think, the sciences, and rather than just look just at altruism, look at discussions of pro-sociality, and cooperations. So I think when you look at moral reasoning and the core reasons for them and so on, it's about these concepts of pro-sociality, cooperative societies, and introspective psychology. And I think when you put all those things together, we have a really good explanation for moral progress, for moral truth, and so forth. And of course, none of this has anything to do with whether a God exists.
Right. I think we can safely say, as the title of uh, Nathan and Team's book might imply, goodness without God is good enough.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming on to the podcast once again, Dr. Carrier. It was really nice to have you here again.
Thanks for having me on.
Yep. Thank you for all your insights, and we hope to see you again.
You bet.